Welcome to Must Reads, interviews by authors of books in the field of homiletics in recent years that we think you should know about. Today, our guest is the Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Frymire. Dr. Frymire is the director of the Compelling Preaching Center at Anderson School of Theology in Anderson, Indiana, and he is the author of a book written in 2006, Preaching the Story. But today, I've asked him to talk about his latest book, published by Cascade Books in 2000. It's very heavily underlined, Dr. Frymire. Cascade Books in 2022, right?
Yes.
And it's called Preaching from Inside the Story, A Fresh Journey into Narrative. And when I read about your rich journey yourself and all the places that you've lived and served, I couldn't help but think of the song by Johnny Cash, I've Been Everywhere, Man. all of those experiences really feed into the invitation that you offer to readers to join you in this, what I take to be a journey toward respect, giving narrative the respect it deserves. So early in the book, you say that a lot of times preachers excise the power out of narrative and replace them with points. And as you unfold the book, what you're doing is trying to replace that with a narrative hermeneutic. So would you say a little bit about what that is in your mind?
Well, first of all, thank you so very much for this opportunity. For me, a narrative hermeneutic is based on the journey that I went through. I learned from Dr. James Earl Massey. He was my mentor when I was learning how to preach. And Dr. Massey was the king of expository preaching. And so I learned that exegetical process in preaching the text and the solidarity of good exegetical experience in the study of things. My problem became that I found it hard to take points and translate that into what kind of person and preacher I was, because I was a storyteller at heart. I learned early on I was good at that, and that those things fed me and that I understood them better. And so I had to learn how to take a combination of how to do good, solid exegesis and then fit it into the kind of narrative experience that I think works well, not just for me, but I think works well in the pulpit in general. Mm-hmm. So my hermeneutic is that I want to preach the text. I want to center in the text. But I believe that the text is more than what's just on the page. Right. Narratives and stories are always about more than the words. Yeah. Exactly. There's newspapers talk about having white space. Right. There's places to breathe and to understand and to explore in the story that isn't just in word number 4, word number 5, and word number 6.
Yeah, so it's Friday from Dragnet. And
yes,
it's not just the facts, man, right?
Yeah, that was one of my, I think, significant insights, that I think most preachers are like Joe Friday, and they look at a text, and the old tagline that Friday had was "Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts."
Right.
And I started to look at what happens if you go beyond just the facts, ma'am, just the facts, and stories do that. And so my hermeneutic really is to let the story speak, but let the story speak within the context of exploring the text itself, exploring the word. I have a high view of Scripture. So I want to stay with the Scripture. I want to stay with the story, but stories are always more than what's there. They never begin where they begin, and stories never end where they end. Exactly. There's always more to the story.
Right. Well, I was intrigued by the way that you ground this hermeneutic in neuroscience and the brain. Can you say a little bit about what you mean by we are wired for story?
I just learned. Part of this came when I was doing my PhD and I was exploring the idea of creativity and how the brain works in creativity. And as I explored some of that neuroscientific evidence, I became familiar with Kant and Hume and Coleridge and some of those folks who really explored the idea that that's how we learn. We learn in imagination, is what their word was, but not a romantic sense of imagination, but Imagination in the sense that we picture things. We learn things by having a movie set in our head. It expands, it explores, it looks around. We're a camera exploring a scene and looking at all the things that are around there. So your brain is wired to learn that way. I had an experience where I was out to dinner with my wife and my in-laws, and they were talking about family history, and I kind of tuned out a little bit. And in the table next to us was two couples, and they were talking, and I did what you should never do, and I eavesdropped on their conversation, not knowing them or what they were talking about. And for about 15 minutes, I just listened to their conversation. And everything went from one story to another story to another story. Somebody would say, yeah, I was out raking the leaves and this and that happened. Said, when I was growing up, we had trees in our front yard. When I was growing up, well, we had this pool, and everything was story to story to story. And I started to realize and to learn that that's how we're wired. We're wired to communicate in stories, and we learn in stories. And if you've got the greatest storybook as a preacher, if you've got the greatest storybook that's ever been written, why fight against that? Why not capitalize on that?
Exactly. Well, then part of what I also found intriguing, I mean, a lot of things, more than we have time to talk about, but one other thing was the notion of the storytelling lens and your kind of categories of getting, as I interpreted it, 30,000 feet up and gradually moving to what you like, flatlander, landscaper, 3D designer, cinematographer, and then finally the interpreter who is sensitive to the more in the story breaks into the story as an insider. Can you tell us, I think viewers would be interested in the meaning of the old theater maxim, break a leg, because that's very evocative for preachers.
Yeah, my youngest son was a theater major, and we were talking about the theater stuff, and he said, "Dad, do you know where the phrase break a leg comes from?" And I said, "Actually, I don't. That's what you always say to an actor. Well, you don't say good luck, you say break a leg." And he mentioned that all the curtains have names in the theater parlance. So you've got the front curtain, the main curtain, but then you have those curtains that are off to the side. And those are the curtains that are designed so you can't see backstage.
Right.
And as an actor, you're out in the wings. And when you enter into the play, onto the stage, you have to break the leg. You have to push the curtain aside and you enter into the scene. That's why you say break a leg. So you break the curtain, you break the leg, you walk into the scene, you're part of the story. Right. And to me, that perfectly captured what I think storytelling really is about, or should be about. And that's where, instead of looking outside the story and seeing it from a distance and describing it, what happens if you're inside the story? If you, in essence, break the leg of the biblical narrative and you look at everything from inside, what's happening as you see it come about, as you see it roll on, as you see characters interact and things happen. It's a very different story when you're inside it than when you're outside it. It's the difference between telling a story you heard and telling a story that you've lived. The one you've lived, you tell from inside. Right.
I thought among the many poignant examples, the one about the difference between reading that the Jewish slaves their infants were being killed by the Egyptians. Well, that's just the facts. But then you get into what would it feel like to have to place your infant in the Nile River, suspecting that he would drown. So the whole moving into the emotion of the text. And then we connect with the emotion of our listeners.
Very much so. And I'm not afraid of emotion. I don't like emotionalism. But I think if you're afraid of emotion, then you're taking and you're dissipating a great deal of scripture, because scripture is full of emotive things, emotional experiences. And that's part of the story. And until we reflect the emotion that's there, we're not truly reflecting the passage. I know I got asked to preach at a chapel at Princeton when I was there. And my last time that I spoke, I did that sermon from the perspective of Moses's mother.
Mm,
So it was a first person narrative sermon of all things as a woman, and as and it very quickly became, and this was the feedback I got, very quickly the people who were listening thought, well, you can't do that. But then suddenly you get caught up in the story and the emotion of the story, and the fact that I'm not Moses's mother, I'm not a woman, kind of dissipates, and
right,
you're attracted by the power of the story, which is why I like narrative. I think the power's in the story, not
right,
in the teller, but in the story.
right. Well, you say at the end that that the drama is in the story, not the performer. So I appreciate the last part of your book as well, where you have five examples of narrative sermons from first person, some of them, some from third, and so I want to thank you for this book. I wish we had a lot more time to go into the details, but we'll leave that to the readers who will now have their appetites whetted to buy the book. Again, it's called Preaching from Inside the Story, A Fresh Journey into Narrative. I'll be quoting you tomorrow in my class. Don't worry. I'll give you credit.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So much for this rich and practical book and for spending time with us today.
Thank you, Alice.